Hello, all you mamas, boys, and girls still living at home, which makes me feel a little less self-conscious knowing I'm not in that boat alone. We gotta stick together, you know? Welcome back to Horror Convos, a casual, relaxing, and occasionally funny podcast where we choose one horror topic per episode and discuss any media related to it that we want. I then give my personal history, thoughts, and opinions on that subject, including examples that I believe portray it effectively. I often have guests join in the conversation, and we hold regular polls for you to vote on what topic is covered in our Patreon exclusive For the Fans episodes. If ads make you want to throw a tantrum, you can enjoy the full podcast ad-free on Patreon, along with other exclusive content. Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, and give a big wet kiss to that notification bell with some flowers so you always know when our newest content is uploaded. Today's episode is the first edition of what I hope to be a fun recurring topic, mothers. That's right, from Norma Bates to Joan Crawford, poor Rosemary Woodhouse, the Species franchise's Syl, the Toddlers and Tiara's moms, and many more. We're going to cover every pop culturally influential female, human or otherwise, to have ever tainted the miracle of life with the hard luck of said life having slid out of their particular undercarriage. If you have mommy issues, boy, is your therapist going to send some hate mail my way after this.
Would somebody please tell me why my worst nightmare is coming true?
So without further ado, strap into your booster seats, hold on to your adult diapers, dip those pacifiers in the most expensive liquor you have, and let's get right into this fetish orgy. I mean podcast, not into that shit. So first, let's talk about the incomparable body horror that is the physical and mental trauma of childbirth.
No! We're in my mother's vagina!
Yeah, in some ways a real-life horror experience, especially if you never had proper sex education. Looking at you, Carrie White's mom, that's a great idea for a future topic. Most iconic births in horror media. You bet your ass we're going to talk about The Fly in that episode. You can sleep on that.
I shouldn't have gone in there. Don't go in there. Promise me you don't go in there.
Me go in there? That's the last fucking place I want to go. Like, I'm gonna go in there.
But even in real life, when everything goes well, it can obviously be traumatic to see. There's a reason so many men have fainted at the sight of it, and sorry to say this, ladies, no disrespect, but I don't think it's typically the result of being overwhelmed by the natural beauty of the female form birthing new life into the universe. That is very romantic. Totally respect that point of view. More likely, though, it's usually probably all the blood, shit, mucus, and you screaming bloody murder as a small human-shaped mass covered in blood, shit, and mucus is squeezed out of your now stretched open pee hole.
I feel everything! Oh my god, it's happening!
Okay, maybe we can take it down just a little. I think you're going to scare the other pregnant women.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Okay.
Are you kidding me?
I think that was mostly anatomically correct, right? But yeah, as much as I do appreciate and recognize what a beautiful, natural thing it is, you can definitely spare me the front row seat in the splash zone unless it's the love of my life in that hospital room, and even then I'll probably just stay near the top half and let her crush my non-dominant hand or deck me in the jaw. I'll already be in the hospital, it'll be fine.
I changed my mind. I want that epidural. I want it, Gary.
No, honey.
Yeah.
No. You said you
Yes.
didn't want it, and you said that even if you did ask for it, that would just be the crazy talking. Oh!
Gary! Get me the juice!
Unfortunately, throughout the history of horror, from what I've seen at least, this is anecdotal, of course, there is often a stigma of mental illness, but specifically female hysteria related to motherhood as it's portrayed in horror. Oftentimes with postpartum depression and being a contributing factor, if not the direct catalyst for why the mom might kind of go off the deep end depending on what story it is, or she might fail to bond with the baby, which in some cases is a direct side effect of mental illness in the story. I didn't think about this until I started researching for this episode, but the more you look at mothers in horror media, there's quite a few of them that have this common trait of mental illness associated with their character. Or like Arthur Fleck's relationship with his neglectful mother in Joker, how Norman Bates was influenced by his clingy mother Norma, Tina's narcissistic cheating mother in Hatching, Willard's emotionally abusive mom Henrietta. The list goes on, and we will discuss more in future episodes on this topic. But almost all of these moms seem to have a common trait of some portrayed, implied, or at least potentially interpreted form of mental instability.
No wire hangers ever!
Even in horror stories with stereotypically villainous parents, there's often an implied element, I think, of that somewhere. More often than not, when the parent in question is female, from what I've seen. Now we'll talk a little about my introductions to the concept of horrific mothers. Those of you who have listened to this podcast so far know that I go into spoilers. If you absolutely cannot and will not stand for that, then I completely understand and respect your decision, and we will see you in the next episode. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. For those of you who are still here, thank God those spoiler-hating film nerds are gone. I'm kidding.
Oh, come on, it's just a joke. Still.
So few things unsettle me more personally than the idea of not being able to trust one's own parents. For most people, their mother is the first bond they form with another human being.
Mother is God in the eyes of a child.
For at least 99% of people on this planet, our mother is our first source of safety and security, our first friend, first person we learn to trust, first teacher we look to for guidance, first example of love. Ew! Oh, not like that. Jeez, you'll need to quit it with the Sweet Home Alabama memes. I swear people living there probably hate that song now because of how it became used to reinforce that stereotype. God, for all I know, Leonard Skinner'd regret it now.
Uh-oh.
Incoming rant.
Alert.
Incoming rant.
Alert, class.
I grew up liking that song because I thought it was a legitimately well-done song. I still do. It used to be so iconic, primarily because of its pop cultural merit as a song. And these decades of uppity Northerners who just can't resist any opportunity to shit on the South ruined it for everyone. I can't even hear the opening guitar anymore without all these memes coming back into my head. I mean, seriously, I had friends growing up who came from Alabama, Maryland, Mississippi, West Virginia, all around the Appalachia region. My grandmother grew up in the mountains. You know, I'm technically a Southerner myself. I grew up mostly in Virginia with a few years in North Carolina. Just take it from me. The majority of us, and unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know this, most of us don't keep it anywhere near that close in the family on average. It's just, here's the thing. Even if there admittedly is at least some truth to those stereotypes, arguably there's a grain of truth to most stereotypes. That's generally what gives rise to them in the first place. You know, along with rumors and misinformation that people accept as fact even generations after it was conclusively disproven. You know, I mean, look at how many of us still refer to the indigenous tribes as Indians. Granted, that's more of an older generation thing, but I think it's fair to say at this point that the material our society loves to parrot ad nauseum about the South, particularly the Deep South, is pretty played out. I'm all for freedom of expression and speech, especially in comedy. I'm unwavering when it comes to my support of the First Amendment. I don't think anything in comedy should be off limits, literally anything, provided the timing's good. There is such a thing as too soon, you know, appropriate time and place. But at the very least, when we roast each other in this country, try to come up with something we haven't heard a billion times over a century now. I'm well aware of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it principle, and that is generally good advice, but we shouldn't treat it as an absolute or a blank check to justify creative laziness, because even if something's not broken, you will wear it out eventually if you rely on it too much and let it become a crutch. You lean on a crutch too long, it does weaken. Like, those two things can be true at once. Just saying there's a gray area, okay? There's a nuance to the art of stereotyping. I fear it's becoming a lost art nowadays, and as any comedian worth their salt will tell you, a proven classic never goes out of style, but you still want to work on it, find ways to innovate over time. I'm sure if you make the effort, there are things you can poke fun at the South for besides incest, bigotry, the Confederacy, religious fanaticism, domestic abuse, alcoholism, Donald Trump, Duck Dynasty, mountain moonshiners, rednecks, cowboys stealing land from the first peoples, and football. I'm not necessarily asking people to quit all of that cold turkey. Just maybe give it a rest for a little while. Take a break. Then gradually bring it back into popularity once you find some new spins to put on it. Like, I love to laugh. I love to laugh at myself. I'm proud of where I come from for all its faults, which every state and country has, but I still have a sense of humor about it. Just give me something new about my home turf to laugh at for a change. It's like the gold rush. Get back down in the dirt, out of your comfort zone, and start digging for new riches again. Okay, where was I? Kissing your mom on the lips? Okay, the proper age to stop doing that, I think, is probably somewhere around... Mom's in horror. Horror. Okay, sorry. So yeah, my first exposure to the premise of a scary mother figure was most likely Cinderella's wicked stepmother. I mean, the animation on her facial expressions, especially her eyes, just unsettled me as a little kid. You know, the animators really went the extra mile to make her look as wicked as possible within bounds for a regular human. But her hair and those eyes in particular, especially in the scenes where she's darkened by shadows, but her eyes are still bright, all of that just made her look like Satan's mistress to me.
See that Lucifer gets his bath.
It's like, even today I look at her, and she just comes across to me like a snake in human skin. And she wasn't as over-the-top evil looking as Maleficent, but she creeped me out more than the evil queen in Snow White. That character, I would say, wasn't designed to look as deliberately nasty or conniving, except for after she shapeshifts into an old woman. Partially because she was supposed to be obsessed with her beauty. That was part of her character for the majority of the story, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense, I guess, for her to not look at least decently conventionally pretty, I suppose. I personally always thought she and Snow White both looked too much like dolls. I think Cinderella was more where Disney started to make their human characters look more human and not prioritize visual appeal to the point of them not even looking really believable as flesh and blood people. It's hard to articulate exactly, but most characters in Snow White look to me like they came out of a 1930s postcard, but by 1950 with Cinderella, I think they found more of a balance between making their movies look like a fairy tale come to life in beautiful animation without making the characters look too blatantly artificial. But yeah, that movie facilitated a lot of prejudice surrounding step-parents for probably many kids, I would imagine. Historically, I think it goes back at least somewhat to the socially and culturally conditioned shame that's been aimed at the spouses of people who got remarried. Even today, often in, I hate to say it, strongly traditional religious communities, there are some parts of this country alone where divorce is still strongly socially discouraged or outright forbidden in the family, even as an option. And, we think that that whole ideology is mostly extinct. It's not quite as close to being in the past as we would think. It's even in cases where abuse is clearly happening, some people still blindly obey this, in my opinion, archaic way of thinking that even the most miserable, emotionally unhealthy person in a relationship, especially a wife, should simply endure no matter what. And if you choose to make your own happiness or even your physical and mental welfare a priority, that can be interpreted in these kinds of families as weakness or a betrayal to God or whatever. There's a much stronger stigma about that, historically put more on women, I believe. Be it a woman remarrying after losing her husband, leaving an unhappy marriage for whatever reason, or even in cases of being dumped by the husband. There's a lot of expectation put on the woman in several cultures when it comes to marriage, the more you look at it. Not to say that men haven't had unjust standards placed upon them, too. There's difficulties on both sides. I mean, you would think that would go without saying at this point. I mean, but wives are historically expected to deal with quite a lot with their man being the head of the household, depending on the couple and what generation of societal norms we're talking about.
We're women. Our choices are never easy.
Yeah, that could be an interesting topic for another episode, too. Maybe horror of abusive relationships in different eras, specifically stories about escaping toxic relationships, perhaps. Shoot, the Lifetime channel was at one point, like 80% movies with that kind of story?
Men are terrible and will hurt you because this is Lifetime.
But if I had to speculate, the stigma surrounding divorce and or remarrying for any reason probably did contribute to why step-parents, mothers and fathers, have been painted as villainous archetypes so many times in media, but because for many kids, most often children of divorce who are very close with their parents, there is an adjustment period where, from the kid's point of view, the parental figure that they were used to, that they loved, trusted, and felt safe with, it feels like that person's being replaced by this intruder who's come in and is now telling you what to do and trying to step into that relationship that you had with, the birth parent, even though you're not related.
Stranger danger!
It's your instincts as a kid who's most likely been taught not to trust strangers can very easily color your first impressions of even potential step-parents with a kind of just instinctive prejudice towards them. So many kids in this situation, it's not uncommon for them to think to themselves, this isn't my mom or dad. What is he or she doing here? If I ignore them long enough, maybe they'll go away. Or in cases of more protective children, especially, I think, often boys, they may feel a need to defend their birth parent who's still present from this invader. Like, I gotta lay down the law, or worst case scenario, chase them off. They're gonna ruin us, ruin mom and dad's chances of reconciling if I don't do something to remove this unexpected new variable from the equation.
I don't like change!
Even though that's usually not the full picture of the situation, to a young mind that hasn't developed enough to understand the nuances of the world and complexity of relationships yet, it's hard not to feel that way. I've been there. I'm a child of divorce. I've been in that position as the kid twice. For a little kid or even a teenager, teens act so much like they're already grown, they know everything, but deep down, it's often almost inherently scary being the child in that position. It's sad. There's typically a lot of emotion all around. It's a lot for a minor to be expected to wrap their head around, especially at a young age, obviously. Yeah, but, it's just, it's challenging. And again, it really doesn't help that step-parents have been made out so often, and at least in older media, not as much in modern stories, thankfully, but for so many years, possibly centuries, you had step-parent characters that were made out to be such conniving, manipulative, or just straight up stereotypically evil assholes in so many stories. From gold-digging stepmothers to abusive stepdads, pretty much every negative trope related to parents in fiction. You could argue that a number of those tropes were initially portrayed, more often on average through step-parents.
And don't forget the garden.
Then scrub the terrace, sweep the halls and the stairs, clean the chimneys, and of course there's the mending and the sewing and the laundry.
And perhaps some of that, depending on the storyteller, is a result of lingering trauma from that author's own childhood experiences and insecurities. I mean, Walt Disney was very close with his mother. He lost her at a young age, and, you could definitely see how that influenced his storytelling. And going forward with you wonder where the trope of Disney parents getting killed off towards the beginning of almost every movie came from. That's a pretty big part of it. Granted, there are thankfully more media now that, like I said, make the step parents more human, more sympathetic, adding more complexity beyond the whole antiquated blood is the linchpin of what makes a family fallacy. Just really contextualizing the step-parent's point of view more as a stranger in a new family, trying to earn their place and fit into this sort of new identity.
Wait a minute. Who am I here?
And unfortunately, again, speaking for myself, almost every time it doesn't work out between your remaining parent and whomever the latest romantic prospect is, there can be this emotional backlash on the child, kind of reopening the wound that was created by the original trauma of the divorce, separation, loss in a tragic accident, what have you. And these poor kids kind of relive that over and over every time a new guy or girl comes into the scenario, which often reinforces their very narrowed perspective of, why can't you just get back together with mommy or daddy, or why do you need to get someone new at all? Like in cases where the mom or dad might be dead, like, I thought you loved it, mom or dad. Do you not, what, do you just want to forget about them? How much longer are we going to do this? The older you get, the more you realize just how narrow and in many cases kind of selfish that mindset was. But again, it's children, it's understandable. There's a widely, if not almost universally relatable sense of grief in stories where one or both parents have been lost for whatever reason, and the caretaker replacing them serves as a sort of antagonist to further challenge the main lead. And in Cinderella's case, I haven't sat down to watch that Disney classic in so long. I mean, it was personally never one of my favorite Disney movies. I'm a 90s kid. I've said before, I believe I grew up with the 80s to 90s Renaissance. But psychologically, I suppose we could interpret the stepmother as a reminder of Ella's trauma and a vehicle to anchor her to this sense of isolation that people with traditional loving nuclear families generally don't experience in the same ways. In certain versions of the fairy tale, the stepmom never loved Ella's father romantically and was only using him to try and get a leg up in the world socially. I don't know if he was rich per se, but I think he was upper class for the time period, depending on what version of the story it is. And then after he's gone, the prince becomes, the stepmom's next target, hence why she tries to get one of her, quote, ugly daughters to impress him at the ball, while Ella is basically confined to the house doing chores so she doesn't get in the way. I personally never thought the daughters were that ugly. I mean, they weren't conventionally pretty, but I never liked the whole stigma and like merchandising of how they were always referred to as the ugly daughters. I think that's a little bit outdated, that whole concept of characterizing people, especially women. I was very pleasantly surprised in the direct-to-video sequels, whichever one it was, where or at least one of the daughters actually warmed up to Cinderella and, it left that ugliness of her personality behind and actually went through a character arc to change for the better. Yeah, that was sweet. So some of those direct-to-video sequels really nailed it. And they earned their place within the I guess the more obscure, you could say, the realms of Disney media. I mean, in some versions, like the 2015 live-action adaptation, I believe they try to make Kate Blanchett's portrayal of the stepmom, called Lady Tremaine in that film, more sympathetic. Some retellings of the classic narrative humanize her more than others. Some go deeper into the politics and economics surrounding why she's trying to marry her daughters off while keeping Cinderella contained. And in that context, we can view her normally viciously perceived scheme as a commentary on classism of the time period, because for many families, whether we agree with their methods or not, the harsh fact is that marrying into wealth was too often the best, if not only viable option for a family to escape extreme poverty. Just women generally just didn't work back then, and those who did, very rarely managed to dig themselves out of poverty. If it wasn't about the money, it might have been for purposes of status, getting into a specific desired job, like successful family-owned businesses, for example, or claiming inheritance, possibly getting into a will. There are a variety of reasons a mom might have pursued this other than the stereotypical, I'm evil, I hate my stepdaughter, and her suffering is my only joy. If you think about it, this is almost the premise of Fairly Odd Parents. Just replace Cinderella with Timmy Turner, the evil stepmom with evil babysitter Vicky, and the fairy godmother with, of course, Cosmo and Wanda. Holy shit. God, Nickelodeon basically modernized the concept of Cinderella in this contemporary episodic series for prepubescent boys. Damn, how did I not notice that as a kid? The most intimidating mom that I saw in film or TV growing up was definitely Chi-Chi from Dragon Ball Z. Not a horror-related character, technically, but God himself could not save anyone who ticked that woman off. Like, superhumanly powerful martial artist, the strongest woman on Earth, until Cyborg number 18 came along. And for anyone not familiar with the concept of what's often called a tiger mom in some Asian cultures, yeah, she's basically that taken to the nth degree. Like, you kids today think Ming Lee from Disney's Turning Red was over the top, that red panda kaiju lady projecting her issues with her mom onto her own daughter in this cycle of generational trauma. Like, you think that's bad? No, that woman, even at her worst, would have gotten her ass put in check so fast by Chi-Chi.
I hope you like black and blue, because you're gonna be wearing it for a while!
I think most everyone knows of Norma Bates from Psycho and the Bates Motel series made decades later. Not to be confused with the 1987 made-for-TV Psycho spinoff of the same name. This was a network TV series that aired on A&E from 2013 to 2017. It was on Netflix for quite a while too, I think. It's a reimagining of Psycho's events that is set in modern day this time, but it's also a prequel to the narrative that we know from the 1960 original. Like, over almost 2/3 of the series is kind of more setting up the events that we're familiar with from the original film. It's basically its own take on the story as a whole, focusing more on fleshing out the relationship between Norman and his mom when she was still alive. Norma is arguably the central protagonist of this series, more so than Norman himself, though he does grow into the character we're familiar with and take center stage over time. The tone of this version of the story is less Hitchcockian psychological mystery horror thriller and more of a dramatic family crime thriller with psychological elements. The fractured mentality of Norman himself and his increasingly deteriorating association with reality and how his mom's influence affects him all still play into it. Those elements are all still there. I mean, the series is chock full of references to Psycho, but a lot of the series is more about his mom and her own psychological turmoil that stems from personal trauma she suffered. She's humanized far more, given so many more layers in this version, which, granted, isn't that difficult to do, since the original version was a a skeleton with a voice in Norman's head at the end. And Vera Farmiga plays her in the series and gives just such an iconic performance, bringing this contemporary version of her to life. She's old-fashioned enough, though, that you could almost picture her as the same woman or personality that could have been the mother to Anthony Perkins as Norman in 1960. Unlike Psycho, where she's revealed to have already been long dead, and most of what we learn about her and Norman's backgrounds is provided in exposition after the fact, Bates Motel takes it all the way back to Norma's childhood, how she became a mom and the series of events that cultivate who she and Norman are, as well as how they ultimately end up by the finale that, we're familiar with. One could argue that revealing pretty much, maybe not everything, but more than I could ever want to know about her, undermines the mystery of her influence on Norman and the mystery of who exactly she was, since all we have to go on about her in the original film comes from secondhand accounts. There's more mystery to it when she's just a corpse hidden in the shadows, who's with Norman, revealed to have been basically cross-dressing as her. I would personally consider that to be the more iconic Norma for that reason of the additional sense of mystery and mystique surrounding her. But in the show's defense, it doesn't really build itself as a mystery in the first place. It was never trying to be another Psycho remake like the Vince Vaughn version. This is more of a psychological character study, like I said, more of a drama. I won't spoil everything in case you want to watch the show. It's 5 seasons. Last I checked, you can still buy every season on Amazon Prime. And so if you're really a deep Psycho fan, if you've seen all the stuff related to the franchise, but you haven't seen Bates Motel yet, give it a chance. It might pleasantly surprise you. Alright, so now let's cover my picks this episode for examples of iconic mothers in horror. So we're just going to cover 2 examples in detail today. We'll probably do that just like 2 examples per episode that covers this topic. First up this time is Pamela Voorhees from the original Friday the 13th, of course.
Jason was my son, and today is his birthday. Look what you did to him!
One of the first female serial killers in mainstream media, the late, great Betsy Palmer may have famously considered the movie, in her own words, a piece of shit when she first read the script. Most likely wouldn't have agreed to do the film if she hadn't been in need of a new car at the time. All that aside, she was a pioneer for breaking traditional gender roles of the time in horror. To her surprise, the film went on to make her a beloved figure among slasher fans to this day, regardless of how quickly her son Jason would become the face of the film series. To her dying day, Palmer was a joy to those who met and worked with her. There generally remains a crucial part of the Friday the 13th franchise in spite of her smaller role, and holds the honor of one of the most iconic decapitations immortalized on film.
Fatality.
So off the top of my head, this character is probably the most sympathetic mother I've seen in the role of a horror film's killer, at least in terms of how frighteningly humanized and relatable her motive is. I mean, obviously I don't condone what she did, and I despise horny teenagers as much as the next guy. But it would be a little hypocritical of me to go around just, slaughtering them. I mean, considering that I was one myself. Well, hey, self-hatred isn't healthy, I do wonder, however, if the story of that first film might have worked better had the group of counselors that the plot focuses on been the same people who were actually there that summer Jason was drowned. Until they rewrote him back to life for the sequels, that is. That would definitely become a pattern with this franchise going forward. Or to, like, Jason just coming back from the dead so many times. He's basically like the slasher or genre's Bowser. Or in some ways even more so than Michael Myers. But it could have been written like one of those murder mysteries where we don't see the killer's face since it's from their point of view. The original movie does exactly that. Basically ripping off Halloween, the original. with multiple little certain characters appearing to see Pamela and recognize her right before she kills them. You know, they conveniently never say her name aloud in those interactions, but you can make the argument that not everyone addresses each other on a first name basis. You know, it depends on the situation and the character's emotional state in the moment, yada yada yada. It's a forgivable plot contrivance when it's well utilized and not overdone, and put it that way. I know you'd have to rewrite the story to explain why the camp was shut down before trying to reopen again. Maybe Pamela back then could have killed one or two of those counselors who neglected her son. Then she got caught and locked up before she could get the others, but she got a court deal of some kind on grounds of temporary insanity. I don't know, but she would have escaped when she heard the camp was going to reopen, I guess, made her way back there under a new name, maybe changed her hair color. Most of the surviving counselors from back then could still be working there as maybe senior counselors mentoring new ones like Alice, and they would all be the first ones to die, you know, before any of them have a chance to warn Alice about who the killer is. You know, you could have a couple of the counselors from back then not working there or living near the camp anymore. Maybe Pamela would kill them on her way to the camp, and their deaths would be the first clues to start piecing together why this killer is targeting these specific people. And the main girl, Alice, would still have to be the new girl attending her first summer on the staff. Otherwise, the twist of Pamela's identity wouldn't work, obviously, since, you know, she and by that point, officially everyone and their mother would know who she is already. And that would also be convenient, I guess, for Alice to be the final girl and coincidentally also the only one that hadn't seen Pamela before, so she gets to feel the shock at the same time we, the audience, do. It's not a perfect idea, I know. If you could just find a way to write it that makes sense and doesn't come off overtly contrived, I do wonder if that would have made the first movie, that first killing spree, more memorable. Well, it would have been part of the mystery, figuring out how the victims, including the former counselors who no longer work at the camp, are all connected. The timeline from the summer of the first killings to the camp shut down and later attempted reopening would also have to be much closer together, like at most maybe 1 to 2 years apart. Otherwise, it would be tougher to suspend disbelief at those same counselors from back then who were teenagers still working at the same camp, you know, in their 20s or potentially 30s. I forget how big the gap, the timeline is between that first summer versus 1980 when the film takes place. You could write them to be, I guess, in their early teens at the time of the summer when Jason was supposedly killed, you know, by the bullies who threw him into the water, and I guess have them in their mid to late teens by 1980, because, you know, otherwise they'd be too old and you'd lose the horny teenager dynamic that we all know was essential to the franchise's success.
We love premarital sex!
But just imagine if the story made these counselors getting killed off in the present appear to be innocent, you know, blameless victims stalked by a cruel psychopath. Alice wouldn't know about the role these senior counselors played in Jason's accident that summer, because maybe they lied to authorities about who was on shift to be watching him that day and what they were doing when he was thrown into the lake. Maybe one of the counselors' parents could have been a powerful town politician who bribed the camp's owners, or maybe even somehow blackmailed the local sheriff to help cover it up. However you do it, I think that could have added something to the twist ending. It would have turned the dichotomy between the villain and the victims on its head by having Pamela reveal to Alice, the one character who would be innocent and ignorant of the truth, that her friends, her mentors, were not good people. They all shared responsibility for what happened to Jason, let him supposedly die while they were too busy boinking and smoking weed to pay attention to this poor, misunderstood, tortured little boy when he needed somebody to help him the most, and his mom wasn't there to do it. They lied about it, and ended up avoiding all accountability. Pamela knew the truth but couldn't get justice for her son, and the harder she tried, the more she was painted to look like she was the neglectful one. She wasn't watching him either, because it wasn't her job, obviously. She was the camp cook, but everyone would spin that narrative around on her like she was a terrible mother who's now taking her grief out on these innocent teenagers, and by killing those first two counselors that she knew weren't there watching, even though she couldn't prove it, she would have only made herself look more like exactly what everyone badmouthed her to be. A hysterical woman. And this would have added to the tragedy of her character, showing how not only her son, but she herself was wronged by everyone else's selfish lack of care for her family. The whole system would have failed her. These damn kids got away with murder as far as she and the law were concerned, and she just wouldn't have it. So she let her desire for revenge warp her mental state until she sadly became the psycho that everyone made her out to be. What I'm proposing probably sounds a lot more like Friday the 13th mixed with I Know What You Did Last Summer, but I really do think that would have worked to benefit the character of Pamela and made her more compelling and iconic as the original killer. I've said before that, she became so obscure that Wes Craven's first Scream movie poked fun at it. She was a normal, everyday mom who lost the most important thing in the world to her, the only good thing she ever really had. She sacrificed everything for revenge, so in my version, she would successfully kill everyone who wronged her, along with everyone who helped hide the truth. It would be less of a manic killing spree and more retribution, and that has more substance to it. You could have her add the adults involved in the cover-up to the body count too, like the sheriff, and Alice would just have the bad luck of working at the exact same camp and befriending the very people who left Jason for dead. So, in a way, both Alice and Pamela are even stronger victims in this version of the story. Yeah, and unfortunately, despite them both being victims, Pamela's too far gone to dissociate Alice from the guilty parties. She's a witness. She's seen too much. She's every bit as guilty, and Pamela's now broken mind. But this would add more layers to her, along with greater nuance to the ethics of her actions, and discussing whether they were justified. I don't think she was ever completely evil, but this would make her far more human and consequently, in my opinion, scarier. Now on to our second and final pick this episode, Vera Cosgrove from 1992's Peter Jackson classic Braindead, aka Dead Alive. The acclaimed romantic horror comedy about a sheltered boy who grows into an independent young adult, falls in love, crashes the craziest house party his town has ever seen.
Party's over.
And after some trials and tribulations, finally breaks his domineering mother's hold over him. Oh, and he also saves the world from a zombie apocalypse. 2004's hilarious undead masterpiece in its own right, Shaun of the Dead, marketed itself as, quote, a romantic comedy with zombies. You could argue that historically Braindead did that premise first. There are obviously major differences between the two stories, but when you place them side by side, there are noticeable similarities as well. Both star an unlikely hero who isn't portrayed to be traditionally masculine. He comes off initially pretty unimpressive or even bland on the surface. He appears to be stuck in a rut that he's struggling to get out of. Lionel with his mom, Sean with his life in general, from work to relationships to his old college buddy holding him back. Both are very close with their mothers, Lionel arguably more so, albeit not in a healthy way by any means. Both are in love with a woman whose heart and life they have to fight for. Sean has to grow up, stop being a slacker, living as a metaphorical zombie, trapped in the societal monotony of his unaspiring everyday routine, become more capable as a man, take charge in a crisis, and prove his worth to win back his ex-girlfriend, who rightfully kicked his alcoholic ass to the curb in the first act. I don't like to dump on characters who were lousy in luck with love, but realistically, when you really look at it from Liz's perspective, Sean does start off as kind of a loser. You know, he's a lovable loser with a lot of potential. Well, he's an endearing character in terms of how much more he can be and how much more we see him become by the ending. But it is understandable why Liz dumped him. Like, it's kind of hard to feel sorry for a guy whose idea of a romantic evening thing literally revolves around going to the same bar for, I mean, God knows how many dates he dragged her to that place for. Or, like, as a kid, I was more sympathetic to Sean. Now, in my 30s, I'm like, yeah, you kind of needed a kick in the pants here, dude. Lionel's love interest, Paquita.
Flawless pronunciation.
Believes they're destined to be together, but Vera won't have it and is persistently overprotective of her son. At least that's how it appears up until the ending. It's very much essentially Peter Jackson's kind of zanier spin on the Norman Bates dynamic with the whole a boy's best friend is his mother attitude. She's such a twisted person that, as Lionel confirms in the finale, she actually murdered his father after catching him with his mistress, which Lionel witnessed as a child, though he'd been convinced for most of his life that his dad drowned saving him. Vera used this narrative to manipulate her son, basically guilt-tripping him into never leaving her so she wouldn't be all alone. The wealthy widow mourning her poor beloved husband in her mansion, and she exploits Lionel's trauma as a mental prison, basically to keep him trapped, not because she loves him, in my opinion. I'm not sure this character, as she's portrayed, ever understood what love really is, certainly not maternal love. From my assessment, she just wanted to possess her son, and I think she conflated that selfish desire with love, or just misinterpreted it based on how society generally portrays it. We see possessiveness portrayed from a variety of motivations or resulting from different inciting events. Sometimes the parent themselves has suffered a loss or other trauma that was the catalyst for it. Most often, from what I've seen, it tends to result from a place of self-centeredness that was always present by virtue of the character's own personality or innate instability. Again, in cases where the mother is portrayed with a form of mental illness. Yes, I do think that's the case here with Vera. In other cases, you could argue it resulted from fear that was kicked off, again, possibly by a past loss, which the parent never really recovered from. Because obviously outliving your child is probably the worst pain a human being can ever suffer, or emotionally. I discharged a couple to a few patients from the maternity ward of the hospital where I volunteered a few years ago, who tragically lost their baby. So in stories where that's the case, audiences can at least sympathize, if not empathize, with the parent despite their pain, influencing their behavior in ways that negatively impact their remaining kid in the present. I would say that for me, parents in horror media with that kind of nuance put into them are generally, at the very least, more interesting compared to parents who are evil for no other reason than just because the plot writes them to be. But yeah, if Lionel and Paquita had been married, Vera would be the most literal definition of a monster-in-law possible.
Your mother ate my dog!
Not all of it.
I mean, she's so possessive over her son that after being infected and becoming patient zero for a zombie outbreak in Lionel's hometown, who Lionel then spends a good chunk of the movie trying to keep hidden and sedated as he searches desperately for a way to help her. He sedates her like multiple times. Why do sedatives work at all on an undead person? Just don't think about it. She apparently has a really bad reaction to the medication he gives her, like maybe a certain chemical in the sedative, I don't know, but whatever it is she mutates into, picture basically a giant New Zealand Marguerite Baker from Resident Evil 7.
I'll feed you to my babies and fertilize the garden with what was left.
And I swear to you, this bitch is so possessive over her grown-ass son that she actually splits her enormous stomach open and tries to trap him back inside her zombie womb in the finale, after which Lionel thankfully is able to cut himself out of her, and she drops through the roof into the now burning mansion and explodes. And believe it or not, that's still maybe only in the top 3 craziest moments that happen in this film. Vera's not even the only zombie mom who appears in the movie. There's this poor nurse who gets brutally killed by the, at this point now zombified Vera in front of Lionel. She then ends up having sex post-reanimation with an infected priest, Father Magruder.
Jesus Christ.
Who was killed and reanimated himself after an earlier fight scene at the town cemetery. My personal favorite scene of the movie and my favorite priest in all of horror. Sorry, Father Marin, Max von Sydow was great in The Exorcist, but he didn't kick zombie ass with martial arts.
I kick ass for the Lord.
But yeah, it's a pretty standard story. Boy dies, boy becomes zombie, boy meets zombie girl, zombies bump necrophiliac uglies, and she quickly squirts out a cartoonishly ugly zombie baby who then wreaks havoc around town as Lionel chases him in a series of, like, Looney Tune-esque hijinks. Yeah, this little fucker makes the zombie brat from the Dawn of the Dead remake look handsome. And, like, the whole second act of this movie is essentially Lionel trying to single-handedly quarantine a growing army of zombies in his mom's house, and shit just goes sideways, upways, downways, every ways, in the most spectacular ways you can imagine. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm mixing up the order of events here. I don't think I am. I would have rewatched this film in preparation for the podcast. That's what I normally do. I just couldn't bring myself to do it except for rewatching a few clips because honestly, the full movie is just too gross for me to sit through all the way again. It left a pretty powerful enough impression on me that I can still picture most of it pretty vividly, so I think I'm good overall. It's definitely not the kind of film you easily forget. Any Braindead fans out there know exactly what I mean. There's a reason it's on so many top 10, 50, 100 zombie films you must watch lists online. You know, like, the third act is far and away the highlight of this movie in terms of production value. Just an absolute circus of carnage. I don't want to spoil too much, but I cannot oversell just how thoroughly fucked up it gets. There is a living, moving, farting, disembodied zombie colon in this picture. What do you even say to that? I swear to God, Peter Jackson and his screenwriters must have gotten a hold of whatever Stephen King was snorting in the 80s when they plotted out this movie. Like, for real, man. All of you who call yourselves Peter Jackson fans and grew up on him through the live-action Lord of the Rings trilogy, I'd imagine that's how most people were introduced to him. I'm not going to play a no true Scotsman fallacy by generalizing that you're not a true Peter Jackson fan if you haven't seen Braindead. But if you're a horror fan and you like zombies, you are really missing out on peak Jackson prior to the Tolkien stage of his career. If you haven't seen Braindead, if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be splattertastic. It's like, seriously, one of the most unapologetically over-the-top splatter films, not just for the zombie genre, one of the goriest movies in all of history, period. Jackson threw everything, plus the entire row of both public bathrooms, kitchen sinks into this film. It's so absurdly gruesome that, no exaggeration, it makes almost everything in every Evil Dead film combined look tame by comparison. That's a bold statement, I know, but honestly, even Sam Raimi would look at what Jackson and his crew put into this and possibly think to himself in the back of his head, isn't this a bit much, dude? And this is the guy who produced the 2013 Evil Dead reboot that set its own record for how much fake blood was used in a literal blood rainstorm. If you don't have a strong stomach, then I understand you preferring to steer clear of films like this. I've discussed before how I personally have never liked Blood and Guts except from an artistic production standpoint. I can tolerate it to a fair extent only because I know it's not real. It's corn syrup and, but barbecue, latex, etc. Even then, there are limits to what I'll put myself through. It takes a lot for me to lose my appetite after watching a horror movie. I almost got sick to my stomach multiple times with this one, like the custard scene with Vera, and then later with the nearly headless zombie trying to eat it. I can't. It took me weeks before I could eat pudding again without thinking of that scene after my first viewing. Again, I don't dislike this movie. Understand, I 100% acknowledge and respect what an achievement it was for zombie films and cinematic horror productions in general. It deserves every shred of praise and love that it gets. It set its own record, I believe, for the amount of fake blood used in it in 1992. As a work of art, I have nothing but respect and admiration for it. It's just never going to be one of those films that I watch over and over. It's not for me. If you are interested, there are actually 2 cuts of the film you should be aware. The original UK release titled Braindead is the uncut version, far and away the gorier of the 2, while the US release retitled Dead Alive, it had some stuff edited out, and supposedly that's Jackson's preferred cut for some reason. But yeah, like I said, Vera Cosgrove, definitely up there with horror's most horrific moms. And that concludes this first episode discussing mothers in horror. Comment below, what were the scariest or just the most intimidating mother figures you grew up watching or reading about? Who are some of your favorite mothers in the horror genre and why? Don't be shy. Remember, this is more than a podcast. It is a dialogue between horror lovers. Here is your regular reminder that Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and ad-free on Patreon. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when our newest content is uploaded. Good night, be well, until we talk again.